I am Daniel. I'll tell you my story.
I once believed that trust was the foundation of everything. I built my life, my work, my reputation upon it. To me, trust was not just a word, it was currency, more valuable than gold, more solid than stone. I gave it freely to those I called partners, brothers, family, in everything but blood. I never imagined that trust could be the very weapon used to cut me down. The fall did not happen in one sudden strike. It came quietly, like cracks forming beneath the surface of a grand building. At first, I ignored the small signs, documents left unsigned, figures that didn't quite match, conversations that ended the moment I walked into the room. I told myself that my partners, my closest friends in business, would never deceive me. My loyalty blinded me to the shadows that had already begun to grow. And then one morning, everything collapsed. A single call shattered the life I had built. Accounts were emptied. Investments, the product of years of sweat and sacrifice, were no longer mine. My name, once respected, was dragged into the dirt by whispers of fraud and incompetence. My partners, the ones I trusted with everything, had left me with nothing but debts and a ruined reputation. They had not only stolen my wealth, they had stolen my name. The newspapers wrote about my fall from grace. Colleagues who once praised me now turned their backs, eager to distance themselves from the man branded a failure. Even the air seemed heavier as I walked the streets, every glance from a stranger carrying the weight of silent judgment. It was as if the world itself had conspired to remind me of what I had lost. I sat in the ruins of my office, staring at the empty desks where loyal employees once worked. The silence was suffocating. The empire I had built with trust had crumbled in a matter of days, and I was left alone among the ashes. I wanted to scream, to fight, to demand justice. But the betrayal cut too deep. It was not just money that had been taken from me. It was faith, innocence, and belief in loyalty itself. Nights became longer than days. Sleep abandoned me, replaced by endless questions that offered no answers. How could those I loved like brothers do this? Was I blind or simply foolish? Each thought became another blade twisting in wounds that refused to close. Betrayal does not only break a man, it hollows him, leaving behind an echo where a heart once lived. But within that hollow space, something stirred. In the silence, in the darkness, I felt a seed of defiance take root. I did not know it then, but the scars being carved into me would one day become the very reason I rose again. For now, I was broken, crawling among the debris of my trust. But deep within, a quiet voice whispered, "This is not the end. This is where the true story begins."
I still remember the exact day everything collapsed. It was not sudden, as in a single strike, but rather like the slow crumbling of a foundation, stone by stone, until the house you thought indestructible finally caves in. That morning, the sun rose as it always did, and the world looked the same. But by nightfall, I was a different man, stripped of wealth, dignity, and the certainty I once carried like armor. The betrayal came from the hands I trusted most. These were not strangers. They were men who had shared my table, drunk my wine, spoken of loyalty as if it was sacred. I believed them. Perhaps that was my greatest mistake. Not the investments I signed, not the contracts I sealed, but the faith I placed in those who wore masks of friendship while sharpening the knives behind my back. The lies were masterful. They built them like cathedrals, beautiful, towering, convincing. And I, blinded by ambition and by the comfort of trust, walked inside willingly. When the walls caved in, I was left beneath the rubble, gasping for air, asking myself how I could not have seen the cracks. The money was one thing. Wealth can vanish and in time return. But reputation, once shattered, it does not mend easily. Whispers spread faster than truth. Suddenly, rooms that once opened to me with warmth now closed their doors. Faces I had known for decades turned away, unwilling to be associated with a man accused of failure, of dishonor. I became a shadow in a city where I was once a presence. Nights grew longer. Silence was my only company. I would sit in the dark, replaying every decision, every signature, every handshake. The shame was heavy, but heavier still was the loneliness. For betrayal does not simply strip you of possessions, it isolates you, convincing you that you are unworthy of trust, unworthy of companionship, unworthy of standing tall again. And yet, in the cracks of despair, something stirred. A faint whisper, almost drowned by the noise of my regrets. It said, "You are still here." I did not rise quickly. No, I stumbled. I fell again and again. But each night I survived was proof that my enemies had not buried me. Each morning I opened my eyes, I carried within me the stubborn truth that I was not finished. The same fire that once fueled my success began to flicker again, not as pride this time, but as resilience. I learned to walk differently, slowly, cautiously, with eyes sharper, with ears tuned to the quiet lies men speak when they think you are weak. The world no longer looked the same. The illusions were gone, but in their place I began to see something real. This was the beginning of my rebirth, not in triumph, not yet, but in endurance. For only by enduring the fire could I hope to forge a new self. My past had been stolen, but my future was still mine to claim.
I had always believed that loyalty was the bedrock of every relationship, both in business and in life. But now the truth was undeniable. The people I trusted most had built an empire of lies on top of my own. Adrian and Marcus were not merely opportunists. They were architects of my ruin. They had studied my habits, learned my weaknesses, and in the shadows orchestrated a betrayal so complete that it left no corner of my life untouched. The first days after discovering the full extent of their deception were unbearable. I wandered through the city like a ghost, seeing familiar streets through new eyes, tainted with shame and disbelief. Every handshake, every smile I had once cherished, now felt like a trap. Every meeting I attended, every conversation, replayed in my mind as if I were examining a crime scene. And the worst part was that I had no one to turn to. The few allies I thought I had either stepped back or, worse, joined in the subtle whispers that eroded my reputation. Money, once a symbol of success and control, became meaningless in the wake of trust lost. The accounts emptied, the investments vanished, legal documents carefully drafted were turned against me. My name, my legacy, my very identity as a man of integrity was sullied with accusations I had never imagined. I was left with nothing tangible, nothing but the echo of deceit ringing in my ears. Night after night, I sat in the darkness of my apartment, staring at the ceiling, questioning everything. I asked myself how I could have been so blind, so naive. How had I failed to see the knives hidden behind smiles? The anger, the bitterness, and the sorrow consumed me, leaving a hollow in my chest that nothing seemed to fill. And yet, amidst the wreckage, I realized something important. I had survived. I was still here. My body, my mind, even my spirit, though battered, had not been broken entirely. It was in that realization that the first glimmers of resilience emerged. Betrayal had stripped me of my empire, but it could not strip me of my ability to rise. The ashes of my trust, painful and sharp, began to harden into a foundation, a new base from which I could rebuild. Slowly, deliberately, I began to understand that the lessons were as valuable as the losses. Every deceit, every lie, every stolen asset had left a mark, a scar, yes, but also a compass guiding me toward the strength I had never known I possessed. I learned to move differently. I listened harder. I observed more. The world had shown its harshest face, and in return I discovered a clarity that wealth and influence could never have offered me. The pain remained, and it always would, but it became fuel. The embers of my former self, once dimmed by despair, glowed faintly, whispering that this was not the end, not by far. The betrayal had changed me, yes, but it had also awakened something vital. The realization that my life, my story, and my rise would no longer be dictated by others. From the ashes of betrayal, I began to see the first outlines of my path forward. It was not a straight road, and it would not be easy, but it was mine. Every scar became a reminder, a lesson, a step toward the man I was yet to become. I was broken, but I was learning to bend without breaking, to endure without surrendering. And somewhere in that endurance, I began to understand that the stars often shine brightest after the darkest nights.
The silence after betrayal was deafening. For weeks, I barely moved beyond the walls of my apartment, the echoes of deceit replaying endlessly in my mind. Every familiar street felt foreign, every friendly face a potential mask hiding another lie. The world had shifted beneath my feet, leaving me adrift in a current I could neither control nor escape. But time, as relentless as it is, has a way of forcing movement. One morning, I woke with a faint awareness. The ruins of my life, painful though they were still mine to navigate. The first step back would be the smallest, most inconspicuous action, yet it would be the most crucial. I began to sort through the wreckage, Contracts, accounts, notes, anything that could offer a clue, a foothold, a thread to pull myself upward. I realized I could not rely on anyone. Adrian and Marcus had taught me that lesson with ruthless precision. Trust once broken cannot simply be restored. It must be rebuilt from the ground up, carefully, cautiously. My first steps were private. I did not call old colleagues. I did not seek allies. I walked through the city alone, observing, listening, letting the rhythm of life move around me while I gathered fragments of my resolve. The first signs of movement were small but significant. I opened a new bank account, not to rebuild what was lost, but to claim something that could never be taken from me: control. I revisited old contacts, not for favors, but to understand the network of my past world, to learn where I had been naive, to see clearly the patterns I had ignored. Every observation, every small action was a step back towards sovereignty over my own life. I began to sketch plans not for a business empire, not for wealth, but for a foundation upon which I could stand without fear. The first tentative designs of a new path emerged. Each idea, each careful note felt like a seed planted in barren soil. The soil was hard, the ground was scarred, but a seed, once planted, has the potential to grow. Pain remained, ever present. Memories of betrayal, the faces of those who had deceived me lingered in the shadows. Yet for the first time I sensed the stirrings of something stronger than hurt: determination. I would not be undone by what was stolen from me. The first step back was not a sprint, it was a careful, deliberate movement. A promise to myself that the fire of my ambition, though tempered by experience, was still alive. Every day I walked further, thought deeper, planned more deliberately. I was learning to survive in a world that had revealed its sharpest edges, to endure in silence, and to recognize that the smallest action could ripple outward into transformation. That first step back was not glory, it was not triumph. It was the quiet assertion that I still existed, and that the story of my rise was not yet finished. From the ashes of betrayal, I began to see the first outlines of my path forward. It was not a straight road, and it would not be easy, but it was mine. Every scar became a reminder, a lesson, a step toward the man I was yet to become. I was broken, but I was learning to bend without breaking, to endure without surrendering. And somewhere in that endurance, I began to understand that the stars often shine brightest after the darkest nights.
The days following the collapse were the darkest I had ever known. Yet it was in that darkness that I found something fragile, yet undeniable. A spark. A small flicker of something that had lain dormant beneath the ashes of betrayal, of shame, of isolation. I realized that no matter how complete the ruin, the ember of my potential remained untouched. It began with small gestures. I dusted off old notebooks I had abandoned in the chaos, filled with ideas, sketches, and fragments of dreams I had never dared to pursue. Each page reminded me of who I once was and who I could still become. The act of opening them felt like opening a window after years of suffocating confinement. I began to sketch again. Not for anyone, not for reputation, not for wealth, but for myself. The work was tentative,
Lines trembled beneath my fingers. Colors seemed foreign after years of neglect. Yet every stroke was a reclaiming of a part of me that had been buried. I did not yet dream of an empire, nor even of recognition. I simply dreamt of being whole, of reconnecting with the part of myself that had not been broken, only silenced. In the evenings, I walked the city streets, notebook in hand, observing shapes, colors, and textures. Inspiration had been waiting quietly for me to return. Each small discovery added fuel to the ember. What was once faint now began to glow with promise. I made the first tentative moves to share my work, not with the world, but with trusted allies in small ways, through discreet messages or emails. Feedback came slowly, yet it was encouraging. For the first time in months, I felt a pulse of something that had been absent: progress. It was fragile, easily snuffed out by doubt, but it was real. Every evening, as I closed my notebook, I felt the spark grow stronger. Pain and anger remained, shadows at the edges of my mind, but they no longer ruled me. I had found a foothold. The ashes of betrayal had given way to the first signs of rebirth. I was learning to stand again, not on the ruins of others, but on the pieces of myself I had reclaimed. By the end of the chapter of despair, I realized something profound. Survival was not enough. Survival without purpose is hollow. But this spark, this ember of creation, was the beginning of my reclamation. I was no longer merely enduring. I was beginning to live again. And in that living, the first traces of a man who could rise higher than ever before were forming.
With each passing day, the spark I had nurtured began to grow into a flame. I no longer moved cautiously in shadows. I began to step forward, deliberately and boldly, with small achievements that fueled my confidence. Every sketch, every design, every plan became a brick in a foundation I was building for myself. I took on small projects, humble commissions that required patience and precision. Clients were few, but each one validated the work I feared no one would appreciate. Slowly, the world began to notice. Praise was measured, modest at first, yet it mattered more than any accolades I had received in the past. This was different. This recognition was earned, not borrowed or assumed. I discovered the joy of creation once more. The act of turning ideas into tangible results awakened a part of me that had been dormant for years. Each completed project was a victory, not over anyone, but over the man I had been, the man who allowed trust to be weaponized against him, who had nearly surrendered to despair. And with success, however small, came clarity. I understood now that my rise would not be a straight path, nor would it be free from obstacles. But I had learned something invaluable. The world cannot take what is created from within. Betrayal may strip possessions, may tarnish reputation, may fracture trust, but it cannot claim inner talent, vision, or resilience. As my projects grew, so did my confidence. I began to plan larger ventures, imagining a brand, a presence that reflected not the man others had tried to define, but the man I chose to become. Each design, each innovation was a testament to my journey. The scars remained, yes, but they were no longer wounds. They were stars, guiding my path.
I realized that my life was no longer dictated by those who had deceived me. Every decision, every step forward was mine alone. I had survived, reclaimed my spark, and now I was rising. Steady, deliberate, unstoppable. The man who had once been left in ruins was becoming a force to be reckoned with, not out of vengeance, but out of mastery over himself and his destiny. The ashes of my past were no longer a prison, they were a foundation, and upon it I was building a life that was authentically, undeniably mine. I thought the summit of despair would be my final resting place, but fate had one more lesson to teach me, that true transformation waits only for those who refuse to vanish. By the time my sketches reached the right hands, I was no longer desperate for approval. I was ready to share my truth, scars and all. It began with an unexpected invitation. A collective of innovators, visionaries who sought not perfection but authenticity, asked me to present my work at their gathering. I had no money for travel, no polished reputation to offer, only the fragments of my heart scribbled into notebooks, and yet they wanted me. I boarded the train with nothing but a backpack and trembling hope. Outside the window, the world blurred past like a film strip of lives I no longer lived. Inside, I repeated one phrase: "They will see me." Not the fallen man, not the betrayed one, but the creator I was meant to be. The event was unlike anything I had known. No grand stages, no glossy pretenses, just minds hungry for truth. I stood before them with shaking hands, pages spread like wings across the table. My voice cracked at first, but as I spoke of failure, betrayal, and rebirth, I saw something awaken in their eyes. They weren't pitying me. They were recognizing themselves within my story. For the first time, my pain became more than survival. It became connection. When the applause rose, it wasn't loud, but it was real. And in that quiet storm of clapping hands, I felt the chains of shame begin to break. Later that night, I was approached by someone who had once dismissed me, someone who had turned their back when my reputation crumbled. This time, they extended their hand, not in pity, but in respect. I shook it, not for them, but for me, because I had finally learned. Forgiveness is not about erasing betrayal, but about freeing yourself from it. From that day, doors opened, not easily, not instantly, but with steady persistence. Every rejection became fuel, every small victory a building block. My work began to travel beyond me, shared in corners of the world I had never seen. People I would never meet found strength in my scars, hope in my sketches, courage in my words. And so I understood. My downfall had never been the end. It was the soil from which a stronger version of me could rise. The betrayal that once buried me had unknowingly planted a seed, and now that seed was breaking through the earth, reaching toward the light.
The hall was silent when I stepped down from that stage, but inside me a storm had already begun. For years I had lived under the rubble of betrayal, convinced my name was nothing more than ash scattered by the winds of others' greed. But that evening, in front of strangers who leaned forward to hear my words, I felt something shift. It wasn't triumph, not yet. It was the faint vibration of truth breaking free from chains. Walking home under the dim streetlights, I realized that my scars no longer spoke only of loss. They whispered of survival. I had been stripped of wealth, of reputation, of trust in those I once called family. They left me with empty hands and a fractured soul. But what they could not take was the fire they had accidentally kindled, the will to rise higher than the ruins. The weeks that followed became a test of that will. My mornings began with nothing but black coffee and blank paper. Yet each day I poured fragments of my mind onto those sheets, designs, strategies, solutions. They were not perfect, but they were mine, untainted, unborrowed, uncorrupted. And as the pile grew, so did my resolve. Slowly opportunities began to return. Not grand, not glamorous, but small cracks of light breaking through. A consultant reached out, intrigued by my persistence. A local business owner offered me a chance to advise on a failing project. Each door I walked through was heavy with doubt, yet behind each one I left a seed planted. No longer did I chase applause or validation. I sought only to prove to myself that I could create again. But success is never a straight road. Whispers followed me into every room. Some still believed the lies, the poisoned stories told by those who betrayed me. I learned to live with the weight of suspicion in others' eyes. And yet, every doubt sharpened me. Every shadow became a reminder. If I wanted the light, I had to carry it myself. Months passed, and something unexpected happened. The very skills I once used to build others' dreams were now building my own foundation. The betrayal that had burned me down had also stripped me of illusions. I no longer trusted titles or accolades. I trusted effort, patience, and the quiet dignity of starting again. One evening, I looked at the sketches pinned on my wall, dozens of them, born from sleepless nights, and realized they no longer looked like fragments. They looked like a map, a vision, a way forward that no betrayal could erase. I thought back to the men who had deceived me, the ones who had counted on my silence, my collapse, and I smiled, not out of vengeance, but with the calm understanding that the greatest revenge is not destruction, but rebirth. They had expected me to vanish. Instead, I was rising, slower than they could see, stronger than they could ever stop. As I stood before that wall of ideas, I felt the weight of my scars pressing against me, but they did not drag me down. They held me upright, like pillars carved from pain, carrying the architecture of a life rebuilt. The shadows had been my prison once. Now they were my canvas, and from them stars began to shine.